So this first talk, again, I'm so excited about this talk. So we have Jason Thompson, who's the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Western Governors University. And he's going to talk about the history and the future of diversity. He was way too modest with his bio, so I'm going to share a bit as well. And what's incredibly impressive about Jason is he's a diversity, equity, and inclusion leader who's gotten results in a variety of settings. So he's done work in a healthcare system. He's done work with the US Olympics and thinking about the national teams. He's done work in a startup accelerator, and now he's working in the education space. Jason's going to talk to us about inclusion and how it's been a hot button issue for decades. And he's going to describe the importance of reviewing how our understanding of inclusion has changed over time, and then analyzing how it will develop in the future. You're going to walk away with some really practical, action-oriented steps that you can take when you head back to your organization. So with that, Jason, I'm going to hand it over to you, and I'm so glad that you're here.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here. Hopefully you can hear me, and I'll go ahead and share my screen here. Hopefully that'll let me do that. I remember the good old days when you had a technical person who would actually do that for you. But unfortunately, it looks like you're going to be stuck with me, but hopefully this will work. Let's see. It is not allowing me to share my screen. I'm not sure why not. Let's see if it comes up now. There we go. All right, so hopefully you are now seeing my screen. And I'm assuming that's a yes. I don't know if somebody can give me a nod or something in the chat, but I'm assuming that everyone can now see my screen. I'm not seeing the chat, unfortunately. But let's move forward anyway. I'll assume that you're seeing that. What I want to talk about is kind of the future of diversity, but where we've come from and what changes and what things are we starting to see. So in order to do that, I think we have to kind of set some context and give us a way for us to see where the world's moving, what has happened, and the changes that we've seen. So what I typically tell people when we think about diversity and inclusion and where we've been and where we're going, I always tell people we need to think about what we've learned and that we have to move from episodes to series. And one of the things I often find is that the uniqueness of this is if you think about, for instance, The Office. I like The Office. I watch the television show The Office. And if you were to start watching that show in season 3 and you're on the 5th episode, a lot of the jokes don't make sense because you have no context, right? It's a series and you have to watch the series to understand the context. That helps you get the understanding that you're going to need. By the same token, if you think about our history, we're in the same place, that we need to do the same process to think about what our history is and how diversity training has changed. Now, when I say that, what I would think of is this picture here because it's iconic. And this little child here, her name is Ruby Bridges, and she was the first person to integrate a school in the South. And she was 6 years old when she did this. Many of you probably have already seen this photo. Here's the next photo. Many people probably have seen and might be familiar with. And this is Rodney King. Rodney King was beaten by police. And I remember in the 90s when this first happened, one of the assumptions were this is going to make change because it's on video. And because it's on video, it will make change. Yet it didn't. That what we saw is a repeat. But even before that, it was interesting because Colin Kaepernick took a knee. Again, this is probably a photo that many people have seen before, something that at the time didn't quite make sense for a lot of people, but clearly it took a lot of courage for Colin to make this step because he basically gave up his career. He's never worked in the NFL since. And we've seen a lot of quarterbacks who are a lot less skilled than him get jobs, and he's just basically been removed from the league. This is another iconic picture. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. You'll see that it's edited, and I did that on purpose because honestly, I just got to the point I couldn't watch it anymore. But this clearly is George Floyd, the last minutes of his life. And the reason I bring all these photos together is because they're part of a series. and it's part of a series in which we need to have a conversation. It helps us understand where we've come from. It helps us understand our diversity, but it's also going to help us understand what the challenges are within our diversity programs and why we continue to see some repetition. What I mean by that is, if you think about it, in this context here, we see that, and I apologize, got ahead of myself there, but the question we see here is when you look at events like Ruby Bridges, Rodney King, Colin Kaepernick, we saw those as individual episodes. And because we saw them as individual episodes, we have struggled. And generally what happened is these events happen, whether it's what we saw with Rodney King. I mean, unfortunately, I've done diversity training long enough that I actually remember at that moment in the trainings that we did and we had conversations. And in many of those conversations, the assumption was we'll have this training and it'll go away. We've seen it when large department stores or Starbucks, whoever it might be, had an issue that comes up, and what do? Let's do mandatory diversity training. The solution is mandatory diversity training. If we send everyone out and they do diversity training, we will have a solution. And that in and of itself, that diversity training is a solution. And unfortunately, it creates the problem that we currently exist with diversity training, and why we've been stuck and not been able to move forward is because we treat these as if they're episodes. We don't treat them as if they're a series of events that are connected. And because of that, the challenge we had is we couldn't hear Mr. Kaepernick. He did a very simple gesture and we couldn't hear it. As a culture, it was impossible for us to hear. And the reason being is he is saying these are connected events. And the response was, no, you don't get it. These are not connected. We've trained on them. They're over, so we need to move forward. And because typically diversity training has always been a response to episodes, the assumption now is, well, we've trained, we can move forward. Haven't we had a Black president? We can move forward. And unfortunately, what has happened is we continue to have the same events that repeat themselves. What we need to do is recognize that these are connected events and they're indicative of a system. And that truth is uncomfortable to us. And that's another reason we struggle, that we would like to think these were individual events and that we dealt with them and then we can go on to the next thing. That would be so much easier. But the reason we're stuck is because we now have to take a deep breath and say, there's something actually more complicated going on here. And I, in fact, am part of that problem, that because I continue to look the other way, it keeps repeating itself. And that's uncomfortable for us to think about that. In some ways, by doing nothing, I am helping repeat it, that I'm actually, in fact, part of the problem. If we don't begin to think about these events as connected, that Ruby Bridges is connected to Rodney King. Rodney King is directly connected to Colin Kaepernick. I mean, there's a direct connection there, which most of us can't see or choose not to, because obviously that's very uncomfortable to think these things are connected. I watched them and I did nothing. Or we'd like to rather think, I actually went to diversity training. It's over. I've checked the box and I can continue. I can go back to whatever I was doing before. That I've got my training, I will move on. This is why we continue to have many of the same problems. But there's another symbolic thing that's happening as we speak as well. Again, I know that diversity is much more complicated and more broad than the experiences of African Americans. But as we do diversity training and as we move forward, there's actually a symbolic thing that's happening that's repeating itself. And what happened is basically the Supreme Court made a decision that, guess what? We have to defend and protect the rights of our friends, our family members, our colleagues who happen to be from the LGBTQ community. That their reality is real and we have to respect that, whether we want to or not. The question we have to ask ourselves is, can we hear Ruby Bridges' parents? As I mentioned to you in the first photo, I want you to think about this for a second. Ruby Bridges, as I mentioned, was basically 6 years old. Her parents get a call and they said, we need to integrate the school. And we would like Ruby to be the first child. They later found out that she would be the only child. Neither of her parents actually could read. and had to make a very difficult decision to send their child to change the world. But they did something else, and this is what the future of diversity is going to be most challenged with when we think about equity and inclusion. Imagine she's your child. You drive to this school, people are outside yelling and screaming, probably some of the most hateful things you've ever seen. They're throwing things. You squeeze your child tightly. You tell her, I love you. And you ask the world a simple question. Please be kind to my child. That's the call that her parents made. Please be kind to my child. It wasn't, the Supreme Court made a decision. You have to follow it. You have to respect it. It was a very simple request of the world. Please be kind to my child. She is 6 years old. She is innocent. And we are doing this because we think it's the right thing, but we only ask for kindness. They made that call to the world, and we did not listen. For an entire year, people lined up, yelled, screamed. On the first day, they were so afraid for her that these guards at UC took her to the principal's office, and she never sat in the classroom for the first day. And for the entire year, this is what was waiting for her every morning. She never missed a day of school. Many days, she was the only person in class. And it began to wear her out. And her parents continue to make a call to the world. Be kind to my child. And we did not listen. She had to suffer for a year. She suffered to the point that she stopped eating lunch. She started having nightmares, but her parents continued. They got up every morning, drove to that school, held her tightly, and made a call to the world. Please be kind to my child. No one came. The challenge in the future will be, the Supreme Court has made a similar decision. When we move forward, will we answer that call? Her parents are calling us still. And if you think systematically what's happened, when Mr. Kaepernick took a knee, what was his ask? Please be kind to Black people. Simply as that. There's a fundamental theme that actually runs through all these things. And many times we make diversity really complicated, but there's a simple theme. Please be kind to our friends who are from the LGBTQ community. In many offices, the question now is, you have to use a person's pronoun. And there's some pushback around whether or not we should use a pronoun, or whether or not that's something I have to do. Would that be compelled speech that I have to give someone else, or have to use a pronoun for someone else? This is not new. We have always used pronouns. 6 months ago, 6 years ago, 20 years ago, if I went to work and I told you, this is my pronoun, you would use it. But now we're at a point where people are questioning that. And if you think about it, the fundamental piece is still the same, whether it's the diversity work I did 30 years ago or the work we'll do tomorrow. The fundamental piece will be the same. Be kind. The call that Ruby Bridges made, her parents made to you, to each of us, is be kind. That is it. Now, the laws can change. We can say whatever we want, interpret the history any way we want, but there's one simple theme that our diversity, equity, and inclusion work always has. It's kindness. That is something we can give. It's something we always can do, and it doesn't cost us anything. It doesn't necessarily tell you have to change your view. And that's the piece I think many times is lost in our diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And in the workplace, because we've lost that, or we choose not to be civil, they created a whole industry that I've worked in for 30 years and fundamentally always do the same thing. Ask the world, let's be kind to one another. Even if we disagree, we should be able to find kindness. And sometimes we've made this thing overly complicated. If you think about it, if I go to work and there are no women who are leaders in our organization, typically that's actually mathematically impossible. There's something going on there that's the opposite of kindness, that we are not validating the experience of our colleagues who've clearly worked hard, and for some reason we don't pay them fairly. They're not afforded the opportunity to show that they can lead. That's the same work that Ruby Bridges' parents asked of all of us, kindness. And that will be the challenge that we've had to understand our own history and the challenge that we're going to have going forward. We can make it much more complicated, and there's data and work that I've done for years, but there is a simple piece here that many times gets lost in this. And the question, and I'll pause here if there are questions, but the question I would ask of all of you is, can you hear her parents still calling us as a culture? That when this US Supreme Court says we need to be kind to our friends and families who are from the LGBTQ community, if our response is, I don't believe in that, it is the exact opposite of kindness, because no one's asking you to believe in anything. We're asking you to be kind. We're asking you to be respectful. Many times that is the piece that's lost. Stop there to see if there are any questions or comments. And I always like to have that moment of silence and that pause, because I do think it's important for us many times to allow silence and that moment of self-reflection, because I do think many times as a culture, we've spent too much time trying to respond rather than pausing. And I think for many of our organizations, as we move forward and we think about diversity, it's often framed as, what are we doing for someone else? We're trying to be kind to one another. That's what we're doing. That will be the challenge of our diversity work as we move forward. And I see here, why is this so difficult? And I do think, I see that in chat, and I think it's a great question. You would think something so simple, but I think many times the reason it's become more complicated for us is we frame it often in what's being taken from me. And if you look historically, especially with little Ruby, I think people thought she was being afforded something that they weren't getting, or they would have to give something up for her to come to their school. Instead of, why are they in a school that's so underfunded and dilapidated? That opportunity for education, for instance, the more education I get doesn't take education from you. We can actually both educate at the same time. And many times I think because of how we frame things and how we see each other, we've made this much more complicated than it needs to be. A lot of the work we have to do to keep track of it is to show many times you can't change your behavior if you don't know what you've done. So a lot of my work has been about measuring and things like that, partly because if we don't, you can't change your behavior. If I don't know what my biases are and I don't track what my biases are, I'm less apt to change that behavior. And I see one of the things here too is one of the challenges with our students is that they lack sufficient knowledge of our own history to recognize that these are a series of connected events. And I would agree. I think it's twofold. One is we don't always teach it that these things are connected, but the second piece is we don't want to, because it reveals an ugliness about our culture that many of us don't want to accept. And many times with my diversity work, that's the challenge, is people don't want to accept that. And partly because it'd be terrible to get up every day and think, wow, there's a systematic process here that's literally holding some people back or creating opportunities for some of us and not others. And that may feel very big and ugly and heavy and negative, but ignoring its reality doesn't make it go away. But that is the decision we've made, is that we don't really want to think about those things. And many times you think about it with Mr. Kaepernick, it was that the problem was people didn't want to think about it. The response was literally, this is sport and politics should be separate. And people really wanted to dictate when they think about history and when they want to think about when things are connected. I mean, we call that privilege. But in fact, that's why we had this challenge, is because people didn't want to connect that dot, because it's painful to think about that. It means we have to think about it ourselves in a way that we don't want to think about ourselves. So we ignored it. And because we ignored it, we have George Floyd. We continue to have the same problem. and I do see this too, where there's an interesting dynamic, because I think, especially in this current political environment, that many times what happens is people go to their own corner. But there's actually a history here that we sometimes forget. The Attorney General under President Obama, and I cannot remember his name right now, actually made a statement. And the statement he made was the US needs to have a very complicated, difficult conversation about race. And he caught a lot of heat about it. Tons of people said he doesn't know what he's talking about, and they pushed and pushed and said and what's interesting is we now have a conservative president who's actually pushed us to have that conversation, which is kind of an interesting dynamic to think about. It is, you would have thought under Obama we would have had the conversation, right? We have a black president, all those things. I see Eric Holder is the name, but here we are with a conservative president, and in a weird sort of way forced us to have this conversation, that we are now having these conversations. And that's why it's so uncomfortable and why we feel so much tension. It's because people don't want to have the conversation, but at the same time we can't avoid the conversation. We have to have it. And you can just feel the tension that it creates. Here's another good point here too in the chat I see is, I do think with social media, and it's still a relatively new concept, it does allow us to be anonymous. And I think one of the interesting things I found too, as you can imagine, this time we're doing a lot of these type of presentations. One of the things we found is that for whatever reason, people are actually more rude in these types of presentations, partly because there is that sense of I'm anonymous and I can write whatever I want. And so they tend to be much harsher, much more critical, because there is this sense of there's no consequence for their behavior. So I do think that's a good point, that many of these technologies, as much as they've helped us, they've also created this sense of, because I'm anonymous, I can say whatever I want without consequence. And I just want to say, it looks like I'm just about out of time here, but I want to thank everybody for their time today. I try to be direct, short, and to the point, and hopefully the conversation landed and gave you things to think about. And hopefully as a tool moving forward, many times is when our diversity conversations get complicated, is to take a pause, allow for some silence, and realize that one of our tools is listening. And that by listening doesn't reduce the value of your own conversation. But I do think fundamentally going forward, that's something we're going to have to work on, because I feel a lot of the tension in my diversity work is because we're not great at listening. We're really good at talking, and many times feels like that's taking from us. We need to remind people that these are moments for us to learn from one another and to hear. And many times we turn it into, for some reason, you're attacking me when you share your story. And that's a dynamic that I think going forward into the future, we really have to talk about, is many times we've created this dynamic by somehow, if I share my story, I'm blaming you because you're white, when in fact it's like, no, I'm just sharing my story. And we don't need to place blame. What we need to do is think about, what is the solution and what are we bringing to this and how can we change it? I think many times the problem I see is that we have created this dynamic that by my telling the story means I'm blaming you, or because I feel guilty, you're trying to blame me, when in fact we have to have this very awkward conversation. And it does create this dynamic that I think we don't talk much about, and that is talking about race. We've always been taught as we grow up, don't talk about race, like that's just taboo, we don't do that. The second thing is, generally when things make us uncomfortable, we move away from them. What are we asking you to do? To talk about race, which makes you uncomfortable, and then stay in that space which makes you uncomfortable. And generally that's unnatural. That's the exact opposite of what we do. And so because we have this dynamic, and I wouldn't say we created it, it is a real dynamic that we have, we continue to struggle, and that our diversity work becomes even harder in the workplace, because generally we don't talk about politics at work, we don't talk about race at work. And now we have this intersection of politics, race, and I'm uncomfortable. So those things begin to intersect. Generally people start moving away from it, because that's what our natural tendency is. And as we move forward, that's the challenge we have to tell people, is you're going to have to stay in that uncomfortable space, that this doesn't change by ignoring it. It changes by us staying in it. And that is going to be difficult, and part of the heavy lift that we have moving forward is continue to have this conversation, which many times isn't fixed. I think that's the other piece too, is people want it fixed. and it won't fix easy. I always tell people, I can't make you racist in a 45-minute training. And by the same token, I can't undo it in a 45-minute training. So what is our solution? We have to have ongoing conversations and training. And if you think about it, I use myself as an example. I was horribly homophobic in college. I'm different now. That didn't happen in a 15-minute conversation. It happened because I was introduced to different concepts and people challenged what I thought. And many times that's the thing we don't do. It's because it makes us uncomfortable. We stop thinking about it, we move away from it, and then it tends to perpetuate itself. And we're in that place now of wanting a quick solution because it's painful, and we're not going to get a quick solution. That we have to take the time to understand what our biases are, ask ourselves uncomfortable questions about ourselves, our views, how we treat one another, and own our responsibility in those pieces. That's why we continue to have the struggle. And looks like I have a few more minutes here. I don't know if there are any other questions. I tend to go fast and short, which is my attention span as well. So hopefully it was helpful. I'm happy to take any other questions if there are some.
I believe we had another question about measurement and diversity and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
Do you follow any particular metrics or monitor them?
I do. Those are good questions. So generally I can simplify it. Number one, I look at promotion, and we look at salaries, and we look at where people are located in the organization. Those are the data points I would really encourage people to look at, partly because by knowing where people are, whether or not they're being promoted or where they leave, it gives you a better idea of, do you have a recruitment issue or do you have a retention? So if you have a department where people are turning over, a lot of times that's hidden because people will say, wow, that department is very diverse, but they don't look at retention. And as a result, what it could be is that it's diverse. You keep hiring people of color, but they don't stay very long because they're treated poorly. So by understanding the data, then you have a better idea of what solution you should put in place. And so for me, when it comes to data, I look at where people are in the organization, who's being promoted, what's the average retention, and then it helps you decide what's the best use of your time. Should it be recruitment or should it be retention? And in fact, it could be both, or is something masking the other? And the example being, as I just gave, is, well, that department looks so diverse, I'll go do something else without realizing it's diverse, but it's high turnover. Like the people of color don't stay there. And that would need to be addressed as well. So typically, those are the data points I try to help people identify and then build strategy around. I don't know if there are any other questions. What do you advise when you have colleagues who are essentially focused on fast-paced solutions to diversity and inclusion, not wanting to take away the momentum? That's a good question. That's a constant challenge. I always tell people the biggest challenge for diversity is unrealistic expectations. And I think you have to stay at it. And again, as I mentioned, one of the things we typically want is a fix. As a result, when someone isn't coming along with the plan, we get frustrated. We want a quick fix. And I always remind people, this is a journey, people at different places. And many times people want a quick fixes because it's uncomfortable. It would be so much easier if couldn't we just check the box here on diversity and move forward. And we have to remind that, we have to stay committed to this. It's a journey. It takes a little while to build a culture, and it takes even longer to change that culture because we have habits that we've developed. And so I know that that's typically not the answer people want, but I usually say you got to stay the course. I mean, that's the challenge here. Isn't so much that there's an easy answer. It's that you got to be committed to it and set realistic expectations. Generally, that's a challenge. Most organizations don't change as fast as we'd like them to. There's quite a couple good questions. Do you see a lack of kindness in the world as a mindset? And I do. I do think we've kind of got to the point where we're comfortable being rude to each other. And so it's going to take a little while for us to reset, I think, and realize, because I think a lot of us are angry and we want to be heard. And so we keep working on being heard rather than listening and validating. And I think it's going to take a little while. I think this question here is, how do you keep people energized and committed? That is going to be our challenge. I think the one change I have seen since George Floyd is the energy seems much higher, and there seems to be a much longer commitment to making change. I think in the past, the reason it was always episodes is that's kind of how we wanted it. We wanted to think we could train away from this and we would move on and we'd be better. I think the point now is we have to be committed to a systematic solution, just like we have a systematic problem and a challenge. The energy piece is going to be a challenge. We're going to have to help people pace themselves. I think one reason people get frustrated is because, again, they have this unrealistic expectation of how quickly we can change this because they want it to go away. And we're going to have to remind people that we have to set a pace here and stay committed to it to make the changes that we'd like to see. And I think that might be my end of my questions and my time.